Humility. Great news, everyone. I have discovered the cure for depression. It's great news. I've discovered the cure for depression. So I have a important point that I would like to make here today. It'll be a windy road to get to the final point, but it is a great point nonetheless, I think. And the reason why it's going to be a windy road is because we are in a season of freedom. Freedom under God, of course, yes, but freedom nonetheless. And that is the season that we are in, freedom. And speaking of seasons, in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon is the writer of Ecclesiastes, King Solomon, and he writes about this wisdom that he has learned, the only thing that he has in this earth, which is wisdom. And he gained it from having everything that a man could possibly want on this earth, and realized how meaningless all of it actually is. So he writes about the fact that he was able to have relations with any woman that he wanted. He was the richest man in the world. He might be relatively the richest man of all time. And he realizes in writing the wisdom that he's trying to convey through Ecclesiastes is he realizes that his wealth is meaningless, and his financial wealth will leave him when he leaves this earth. And so with his wealth, he lives a hedonistic lifestyle, and he finds himself getting wine drunk and partying all of the time. But the drunkenness wears off, and he describes how when the drunkenness wears off, he's back to suffering. And that there is no profit in getting drunk off of wine. He was getting drunk off of wine. And so what he does is he puts all of his time into work, his duty as a king. And in putting all of his duty into the king, he finds a little bit of pleasure in it for a little while, but after a given amount of time, he sees everything that he has built and everything that he has created, and he's like, I'm going to have to give this to someone else when I leave this earth. I'm going to pass the baton to them, and it could be a fool, an absolute fool who inherits this work. The labors that I'm doing right now are ultimately trivial. There is a seasons, a time for building and a time for tearing down, a time for rest and a time for work. And he can't bring himself to continue doing this worldly work and thinking that that alone is going to satisfy his life, because it's ultimately trivial. It's ultimately going to be torn down. So what's the point? And it's similar to the whole thing is similar to Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, because Marcus Aurelius writes Meditations, and Marcus Aurelius conveys, it's his journal, so he's not trying to write to anyone. But he conveys this wisdom that he learns. You can read the wisdom that he himself has learned through being the emperor of the Roman Empire. But in the same way that Solomon realizes that his work will all be torn down, we know historically that Marcus Aurelius had to give somehow Marcus Aurelius' son ended up being the next emperor. And Marcus Aurelius' son was one of the worst emperors of all time. I can't remember his name, but he was one of the worst emperors of all time. So these two are in the same boat. And Solomon learned something very important, but rather than convey what Solomon learned, the wisdom is extrapolated out later in the Bible. So we'll just jump to that in a moment. But what Solomon is trying to convey ultimately is that this world is meaningless. Anything that you do, any pleasure that you seek, even the work that you could do, It's all meaningless. The seasons will change. There is no profit, and he sees within himself that most of what he chooses to do is ultimately out of vanity. Now, in The Stranger by Albert Camus, The Stranger is a fictional book by Albert Camus, and the narrator it starts off with his mother dying. He says, "My mom died today." And he's in a state of depression. He's in a state of meaninglessness. He sees that he's apathetic. He doesn't care about anything. He sees that the world is completely futile. There's only futility within this world. And the book follows the narrator going through a day and getting drunk and ultimately committing a crime of which he has to go to court for. And he's guilty. He's guilty, and they sentence him to death. So the reason why I bring up Albert Camus in context, The Stranger by Albert Camus in context of Solomon, is because the narrator, the character in The Stranger, ends up getting persecuted, getting convicted of a crime and sentenced to death because it is murder that he is convicted of. And the narrator doesn't care. He doesn't care that he's sentenced to death. He doesn't care if he lives or doesn't live. Both of these things are irrelevant to him because nothing matters. He doesn't care about anything. So this narrator is in a similar state as Solomon, complete apathy. But Solomon took it to a one step further, not the entire motif of the cure for depression that I'm describing isn't, I believe, properly or entirely illuminated in Ecclesiastes. It's extrapolated later in the Bible. It's unraveled later in the Bible. And so the reason why I bring up Albert Camus and The Stranger is because when the narrator gets persecuted, that's synonymous with the story of Christ, because Christ gets persecuted, Christ gets put to death. And I looked at these two scenarios and I'm like, why is Christ admirable and Albert Camus' character, there's something slightly admirable about the character, but there's something entirely missing as well. It doesn't describe a proper way to live. It doesn't describe the cure for depression. And the issue with the narrator and Albert Camus' The Stranger is that the narrator realizes that existence is somewhat futile. There's going to be a fatal demise that he can't control. Which is similar to Christ, although Christ takes it upon himself and does it willingly, which is the admirable aspect of it. But I contemplated that, I thought about that, I wrote about that, and the thing about Albert Camus' character in The Fall is that, and somewhat similar to Solomon as well, is that the narrator in The Stranger doesn't have a love for other people. He's apathetic to everything and everyone. He doesn't have a love for humanity. And so you look at the story of Christ, and there's 4 gospels, and so typically when people read the story of Christ, it's so understood in our modern world. Everybody kind of knows the story of Christ, and so when you read it, even before you read it, you know that it'll end with Christ being crucified on the cross. And so you can, and he also knows that he is going to be crucified on the cross throughout his entire life. And so if the stranger knows that life is futile and that he's going to have a fatal demise, and Christ sees that this world itself is futile, and he knows that he knows the way that his life is going to end, and he's going to have to go into death, that his walking on this earth is only for a temporary amount of time. Why is Christ admirable? And it is because the love for other people, the love for humanity. And I didn't know what to do with that information, because I was like, all right, in regards to depression, I think people walk around this earth and they are sad. And I'm talking about myself, of course. Anytime I talk about anything, I talk about myself. I'm referring to myself because I struggle with all of these problems as well. And so I'm like, well, I walk around this world sad. People walk around this world sad, deflated, depressed, defeated. Why can't I be more like Christ? I'm not saying I'm trying to be Christ, obviously, but to Christ is the way. You want to follow Christ, you want to be like Christ. Why can I look towards my own future, know that my time on this earth is temporary, but still, despite seeing that, realize know that it is futile to fight against it, but have a depression towards the temporary nature of this world as well, like what Solomon is describing. And the argument that somebody could make, and that I would make internally with myself, is that some days are bad. Sometimes people betray you. Sometimes people are against you. And why are you going to lead with love? Why are you going to treat humanity with love when that is the case? Sometimes, some days it doesn't feel like you should treat humanity with love. You shouldn't treat others with love. Is how it seems. So why is Christ able to do that? Some people who walk this earth, everybody's got a hard life. Everyone has tragic things happen to them, trauma. My life isn't any harder than anyone else's in general. It's not any easier. We're all in this plane of suffering. So despite the fact that we are in a place of suffering and we have to suffer unto our death, how can we do that with joy, love? How can we focus on what is excellent? And the thing is, in the midst of resentment and disdain towards other people, that is when we are convinced that maybe leading with love, treating people with love, isn't actually the proper thing to do. And so, as I was thinking of depression, I mean, you got to look at everything objectively, and it's like, well, maybe the character in Albert Camus' story is right. Maybe life is meaningless and hopeless, and nothing actually matters. And so I'm looking at that, and I'm like, is he right? Does nothing actually matter? And the thing is, despite the fact that we have trauma ourselves and we get into the midst of suffering, and thoughts rattle around in our subconscious that we shouldn't treat people with love, the reality is that those thoughts aren't true. Those thoughts aren't true. Those thoughts are lies in the mind. And so I'm like, well, how do I know that those are lies in the mind? Humility is the deliberate thinking of other people as opposed to focusing all of your attention on yourself. And sometimes we get out of a state of humility, out of a state of love, and we focus on, it's like we're trapped in our mind. We're trapped in our mind, and we identify with the negative thoughts that we have. And so the solution is humility, in terms of when the trauma that we've experienced within our life causes us to not to desire that we can drop our burden. We have a burden to carry in this world, and when those thoughts try to convince us to drop the burden rather than carry them admirably, humility is the breath and the step back and the reset and the thinking objectively, like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the way that I'm seeing the world is completely wrong. And so what Christ did is, again, you read the four gospels and you read the first one, so you know how the other three are going to end. So you know the end for Christ. And not only do you know the end for Christ, you know that he knows his own end. So it's like Christ is an individual who has come down from heaven to walk on this earth. He is the way. He's doing it properly. He is objectively the most admirable individual entity being to walk this earth. And he knows specifically what is going to happen. He knows that he's going to be betrayed. He knows that he's going to be persecuted. And he knows that he's going to suffer unto his death. And it's not people use the word suffering. It's not an abstract thing like, oh, the word suffering, pain. It's not just the word. He literally knows specifically what is going to happen. And so for me, if I look at my own life and I'm like, oh, I can look towards the future. I know that my life is temporary. I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to suffer unto death. I'm going to suffer before I die until it takes me to my final demise. Can I accept that? Not theoretically, not in an abstract way, but can I literally accept suffering unto death? Could I accept following Christ? What if I myself had to be crucified? Can I accept that? Christ is the way. Christ did it first. I'm trying to follow Christ, and obviously my whole biology, my being doesn't want to be crucified, but that's what you have to accept. You have to accept the worst case scenario. And I've thought about this consistently throughout my life, but sometimes I've sat on a park bench and I've spread my arms out wide, and I've imagined that spikes were going through my hand. Spikes were in my hands actively and in my feet. And when I meditated on that for a while, I think that's the fundamental nature of reality. That is the truest thing possible. And so life is kind of like it is real, but in a way it's kind of like a dream, and we are all the realist existence, the realist experience is the experience of Christ and the end of being crucified. And so it kind of sometimes seems like we are all living almost in his dream, if that makes any sense whatsoever. We are living in the dream of Christ, the man who willingly and deliberately came down from heaven, allowed himself to get crucified. And we have to accept that that is the most we walk through the day and we go to coffee shops, we go to work, we go to the grocery store, we do things like that. And that is happening, but the essence of what is happening constantly is the crucifixion. So, right. So, in order to cure depression, in order to not be depressed, if you know the brevity of life, if you know how short life is, then you will have wisdom. You have to know, you have to gaze into the future from time to time, see the worst case scenario for your life, literally, not in an abstract theoretical way. Yeah, it's in your imagination, but literally see the worst case scenario, not in order to bring about the worst case scenario, but worst case scenario in terms of externalities, external things that can happen to you that are completely out of your control. And no matter what you do, you are going to face them. Like Solomon, there's nothing that he could possibly do to avoid it. He is going to find his own demise. It is before the time of Christ. He didn't have the crucifixion to think about explicitly. And so he sees life as meaningless. And so the conclusion that Solomon comes to is that he sees the first of the two rules that Christ brings up, which is that he is dedicating his life to upholding God's law. Old Testament, Ten Commandments, upholding God's law. And we can look towards our own future, see the worst case scenario, again, not to bring about the worst case scenario, but to know it objectively, accept it, and then in accepting it, despite the fact that it is inevitable, who can you be? Who can you be? Can you uphold God's law? Can you uphold these two greatest commandments, which is to love God with all thy heart and to love thy enemy as thyself? Love everyone as though they are yourself. And when you do that, the paradox is that you are going into suffering. You are deliberately walking into suffering. But despite that, the pain of life comes from trying to avoid suffering and fighting against something that is ultimately futile. And so when you accept it, the paradox is that somehow that is where you find joy. That is where any sort of depression, defeated feelings, deflation, inadequacy, insecurity, that is where it all dissolves. You can focus on what is truly important. And in the moments when you are in your own trauma and you think that it is pointless and meaningless to try to love others as though they are yourself, find humility and realize that that is what is true, that you ought to love your neighbor, the stranger, your enemies, your family, your friends, as though they are yourself. And when you're not actively doing that, when that love is not flowing from your heart, the problem is not with the world. The world is what it is. We know what the world is going to be. The problem is with your own vision. There's something about the world that you are seeing in a wrong, incorrect way. And if you correct your perspective, it is like your heart will be pierced and love will once again flow from your heart. You will repent of the corruption that you participate with in the world. And you are still going to go into the worst case scenario, but somehow in following Christ and picking up your own cross and walking into the things that you cannot control as the best version of yourself, somehow it is all worth it. It is greater than worth it. It is good.